The Haunted Cabin I Couldn't Escape, True Paranormal Horror / Have you ever felt trapped in a place you couldn't escape, no matter how hard you tried? That's what happened to me at the cabin in the woods. I went there for a quiet weekend getaway, but what I experienced was anything but peaceful. The more I tried to leave, the more it pulled me in. This is the terrifying true story of the haunted cabin I couldn't escape. What do you think happened to me? Have you ever been stuck in a place like this, unable to get away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and share any creepy experiences of your own. Want to hear more stories? Let me know what you'd like to hear next. It was supposed to be a simple escape, a way to disconnect from the noise of daily life. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work, family, stress, so I decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the woods. I found the place online, a cozy little cabin on the edge of a small forest, far from the bustle of the city. The photos looked perfect, a rustic, charming cabin with a fireplace and large windows that offered beautiful views of the surrounding nature. I thought it would be the perfect place to relax and recharge. The drive there was long, and the further I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches reaching out like dark arms, and the roads became narrower and rougher. I started to question my decision, but it was too late to turn back. I had already committed. When I finally arrived, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The cabin was exactly as it looked in the pictures, small but inviting, with a stone chimney and a front porch that overlooked a quiet, dense forest. The place seemed peaceful at first, nothing out of the ordinary. The air was fresh, and there was a stillness about the place that felt almost unreal. The owner of the cabin, a quiet woman in her mid-50s, greeted me with a warm smile. She handed me the keys and explained a few things about the cabin, how to use the wood stove, where the firewood was stored, and the best places to go for hiking. She seemed friendly enough, but there was something strange in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. She told me to make myself at home and said that if I needed anything, to feel free to call her. I waved goodbye and watched as she drove off down the long, winding road. Once she was gone, the only sound that remained was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I made myself comfortable inside the cabin, lighting the stove and unpacking my things. I was eager to unwind and forget about everything for a while. The first night was calm. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I sat in front of it, sipping tea and reading a book. The air outside was chilly, but inside the cabin, it felt warm and cozy. As the night wore on, I began to feel more and more relaxed. But as the hour grew late, I started to feel something odd, a strange, creeping sensation, like I wasn't quite alone. I brushed it off as nothing more than tricks. But when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling. The bed was comfortable enough, but I couldn't fall asleep. I tossed and turned, listening to the wind howling outside and the occasional creaking of the cabin's wooden walls. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the window. But the tapping continued, steady, rhythmic, like someone was knocking on the door. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't heard anyone approach the cabin, and it was too late for anyone to be out here. I was miles from the nearest neighbor. I lay there in the darkness, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. It kept coming, louder now, as if whoever was outside was getting more insistent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and got up, my legs shaking. I moved quietly toward the door, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles were white. When I opened the door, no one was there. The area outside was empty, the yard bathed in the faint light of the moon. I looked around, trying to find any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, nothing but the stillness of the night. I closed the door and locked it, my heart still pounding. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, knocking on my door? And why hadn't I heard a car or footsteps? The next morning, I tried to put it out of my mind, for a walk through the forest, enjoying the peace and quiet. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground. I took deep breaths, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But the unease never left. That afternoon, I decided to do some cleaning around the cabin. I wanted to make myself feel more at home, but as I was dusting off an old shelf, I noticed something strange. Behind a pile of books, there was a small wooden box. It was old, its surface worn and chipped, as if it had been there for decades. I carefully picked it up, my curiosity piqued. The box was locked, but the key was sitting right next to it, as if someone had left it there on purpose. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the box and opened it. Inside, there was a small, faded photograph of a family. Two parents, a young boy and a girl. The photo looked like it had been taken years ago, perhaps in the 1950s or 60s, but it was the writing on the back that caught my attention. Forever together, no matter what. It was written in a neat, looping script. I frowned, wondering what it meant. The family in the photo looked so happy, but there was something about it that unsettled me. I set the box down and tried to shake the feeling of dread that washed over me. That night, things took a turn for the worse. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in front of the fire when I heard it again, tapping. This time, it was coming from inside the cabin. My heart stopped. I glanced around, but there was no one there. The tapping continued, louder now, as if it was moving closer to me. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stood up. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, from deep inside the cabin. I moved through the rooms, shining the beam of light into the corners, but there was nothing, no one. I returned to the living room, my hands shaking. That's when I saw it. There was something different about the photo. It was no longer where I had left it. The photograph of the family had moved. It was now facing down, as if someone had turned it over. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. I was alone in the cabin, yet it felt as if something was there with me. Something I couldn't see, but could feel in every inch of my body. I ran to the door, but before I could open it, the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could hear the tapping, louder than ever, now coming from behind me. I turned around, my flashlight trembling in my hands. And then I saw it, a figure, a shadow. It was standing in the doorway to the next room. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. Cold, menacing, and it was coming closer. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the air around me had turned to stone, holding me in place. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps silent, and as it got closer, I could feel the temperature drop. The room was freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I couldn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The cabin was silent once again, but the air still felt thick with something I couldn't understand. The next morning I left. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I packed my things quickly, my heart still racing from the terror I had felt the night before. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin. It stood there, silent and still. But I could swear I saw something move in the window, a shadow, or perhaps a figure watching me leave. I haven't returned since. I've tried to forget about the cabin, but every so often, I remember the photo, the tapping, and the shadow that followed me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the cold presence behind me, reminding me that I was never truly alone in that cabin. What do you think? Have you ever stayed somewhere that you couldn't escape? What would you do if you were trapped in a place like that? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and share your own creepy experiences. If you want to hear more stories, let me know what you'd like to hear next.